In the early hours of Thursday, February 27, 2025, Mr. Hackman and Ms. Arakawa were transported to the office of the medical investigator. An autopsy was performed. Initial findings noted no external trauma to either individual. The manner and cause of death has not been determined.
A mystery still unsolved in the desert. More clues continue to trickle in surrounding the deaths of Hollywood star Gene Hackman, his wife, and their dog. We're learning today that Hackman's pacemaker could be the biggest piece of evidence investigators have in figuring out what went wrong. We're on the case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. The sheriff in Santa Fe, New Mexico said it could take weeks until we get final autopsy results and toxicology test results to determine the cause of death for acting legend Gene Hackman, his wife, and their dog. And as we wait, the questions are only mounting. One of the big questions that could hold a lot of answers has to do with the 95-year-old Hackman's pacemaker. This is what the sheriff said about that pacemaker on Friday during a news conference.
Both individuals tested negative for carbon monoxide. An initial interrogation was conducted of Mr. Hackman's pacemaker. This revealed that his last event was recorded on February 17th, 2025. I was advised that a more thorough investigation will be completed.
So this means Hackman died 9 days before his body was found. Many pacemakers do have the ability to relay information to doctors, but for Hackman's to not have recorded a heart rate for more than a week, apparently his did not alert those outside his home that something had gone wrong. The other big batch of information we have is from a search warrant that deputies used to gain access to Hackman's home. Here are the items that deputies took from Hackman's home as evidence last week. 2 green cellular devices, thyroid medication, diltiazem medication, which is a calcium blocker that's used for high blood pressure, Tylenol, records from MyQuest, which is how patients schedule blood tests, things like that through Quest Diagnostics, and a 2025 monthly planner. Now, as police are trying to piece together a timeline leading up to the deaths of Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa, it's unclear how those items could paint the picture of what happened and what life looked like in the days leading up to their deaths. The sheriff didn't give information on whether there were events in that planner beyond the day the two were found dead, and said that they planned to look through the cell phones and text messages to try and build that timeline. We know through initial reports that Arakawa was found in a bathroom with a prescription bottle and pills spread on the counter, but the sheriff refused to go into more detail on Friday about those medications. Listen to this.
There are names on prescription bottles. Do we know any idea as to who was taking any of those medications?
Yeah, due to HIPAA, I don't want to release who the medication was prescribed to or what the medication is. I think there's a HIPAA concern there, so I won't release that information.
Sheriff, do you know the nature of the pills that were found by what were those pills there?
What were they? I think I just answered that question. I think I stated I'm not going to release the actual medication or who it was prescribed to due to HIPAA.
But again, as we just said, we do know what those medications were per the search warrant that was released to the media. The sheriff said there are no surveillance videos from the house, and he said that Hackman and his wife, they were very private people. Hackman had 2 daughters and a son. And in a statement to People, his 2 daughters, Leslie and Elizabeth, and his granddaughter Annie said, quote, "It is with great sadness that we announce the passing of our father, Gene Hackman, and his wife, Betsy. He was loved and admired by millions around the world for his brilliant acting career, but to us, he was always Dad and Grandpa. We will miss him sorely and are devastated by the loss," end quote. In an interview with the Daily Mail, Hackman's daughter Leslie said that she and her dad were close, but she admitted that she hadn't spoken to him in a couple of months. Hackman's son Christopher, who's now in his 60s, has not spoken to the press yet since the death of his father. Hackman's 3 children were from his first marriage to a woman named Faye Maltese. That was a marriage that lasted from 1956 until they divorced in 1986. She died in 2017. Hackman had been married to Betsy Arakawa since 1991. She was a classical pianist who, according to a 1989 New York Times Magazine article, met her future husband while she was working part-time at an LA fitness center. Before we get back to today's episode, what do so many of the stories that we cover here on Law and Crime have in common? It shows that life's unpredictable and having a great attorney matters. And that's where we bring in our partner and sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. Morgan & Morgan is a law firm with more than 1,000 attorneys with a history of winning. Just recently, they were able to secure $29 million for a bicyclist in Philadelphia, $2.7 million for a car crash victim in Florida, and $5.6 million for a car accident victim in Georgia. And in that case, the insurance company was going to offer $0. So even if you don't think your case is worth millions of dollars, why not fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so easy. With just 8 clicks on your phone, you can file a claim. Head over to forthepeople.com/OTC and you can get your claim started today. Also, head down into the comments section of this video. You can see we have a link pinned in the comments. Police say both Hackman and Arakawa's bodies were found decomposed, with Arakawa's hands and feet showing signs of mummification, which means they were dead for several days before they were found. One of the people who found them on Wednesday last week was a man named Jesse Kessler. He was a contractor in Santa Fe who says he's worked for Hackman on his home for 16 years. Now, he wouldn't describe specifically what he saw when he arrived at Hackman's home, but he did release this statement to Fox News Digital. Quote, "Gene and Betsy, thank you for the 16 plus years of opportunity, friendship, and trust. Gene Hackman, thank you for lending a hand on projects over the years. I could not believe at the time I was actually working side by side with a legend. Thank you for treating my sons and employees so well and as equals. When on the job, you were just one of the guys. Thank you for all the stories which I will always remember and will cherish forever. Betsy Hackman, thank you for the years of friendship, generosity, opportunity, and trust. Thank you for your love of dogs, including my own. Thank you for all the advice and consoling. Thank you for being such a beautiful person. You both will always be near and dear to my heart and greatly missed. Love you both." Police say Kessler was the first to arrive at the home on Wednesday and then called neighborhood security. Police say one dog was found dead, but 2 more were alive on the property. Police have also ruled out the possibility of carbon monoxide poisoning as a cause of death. Hackman's daughter also said that she felt like her dad was in good shape, though he was 95 years old, and Arakawa had a positive influence on his health and fitness. Joining us now to talk more about the possibilities of what this autopsy could uncover and what we know at this point in this case is Professor of Forensics at Jacksonville State University in Alabama, Joseph Scott Morgan. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. I'm sure this is fascinating in your world, like what we know and what we don't. One question that I thought about over the weekend was related to the pacemaker that Gene Hackman had, that apparently showed its last event 9 days prior to him being discovered. In your experience, I know you're not a cardiologist. Wouldn't a pacemaker send information typically to a doctor where if it stopped working, that someone in the outside world, outside of his home, would know that there was a problem?
Yeah, it normally does, and it all depends on what type of technology you're talking about. And it's certainly something that in post-mortem context that can be examined, and that means after an autopsy has been performed and the pacemaker is removed. But with the technology that we have nowadays, that is a possibility. And I guess probably one of the lingering questions would be, first off, what type of technology was it that governed this item, and then if it was something that was in a more modern context, why didn't anybody alert to it? Because it's pretty significant, and you're talking many days downrange since you had any kind of recorded life signs that this thing would have been given off. We've already had that validated. The ME has already stated that pretty plainly.
On Friday, the Santa Fe County Sheriff said the preliminary autopsy results weren't able to determine the cause of death. What is different between how a preliminary autopsy is conducted and the type of information you can grab to then the final autopsy result that we presume would be able to give us a cause of death that may come weeks from now?
Yeah. Well, let's look at it this way. First off, you're fighting a couple of battles here. First off, anatomically, and much has been stated about this, that both sets of remains are in um, somewhat of a state of decomposition. And to what extent each individual remain was decomposed, we don't really know. My suspicion is, at least, it sounds as though Miss Arakawa's remains may have been down a bit longer. They keep using terms like mummified, which is something you don't hear a lot. We talk about it in medical legal um, context many times, and it's certainly not something that is anything like mummification in ancient Egypt. It's a term that we use. I prefer actually the term desiccation, which means a drying out. And this is being demonstrated in the standard locations, by the way. They did mention hands and feet having a mummified appearance. And then they talked about, not to get too far off in the weeds because this is rather grotesque, but they talk about bloating, which is a consequence of decomposition. They didn't really talk as much, particularly in that initial search warrant, about Mr. Hackman's status, though. They said, I think, and forgive me, I'm doing this off the top of my head, but that he was similar, but I don't know how much similar. And there's a very fine line here. She was found actually in a bathroom, whereas he's found out in a mudroom. And believe it or not, there are going to be temperature differences in both of those locations, more than likely, and exposure perhaps to some of the other elements surrounding the home, both within and without. It's a fascinating kind of pairing. You don't get a lot of, in my field at least, or in my experience, you don't get a lot of these simultaneous deaths unless they are some type of trauma event or some type of agent that the individuals have been exposed to. It's kind of a rare event where you have two cases of potentially natural death. Now, back to your point, I'm sorry I went kind of far field there, but the first thing that you're fighting here is decompositional changes and what can you appreciate at autopsy. Sometimes it's not quite as clear because of the changes that have taken place to the tissue. And then you still don't have the microscopic results on the tissue. So the stage after the autopsy, where samples of all of the organ tissues are taken, they'll be examined microscopically. And that means that they're put onto slides, they're stained, and you're looking for different manifestations, in depending upon what organ system you're talking about, the brain, the heart, the lungs. For instance, in the heart, you're going to look for changes that might be consistent with what's referred to as a myocardial infarction, where the myocardium or the heart muscle dies as a result of a blockage. That's classic heart attack. Sometimes you can appreciate that even with decomposed bodies. And obviously with the brain, you're looking for evidence of perhaps a cerebral vascular accident, otherwise known as a stroke. And that'll take some time for those tissues to be prepared so that the pathologist can examine them. And then beyond that, what makes this truly incomplete is the fact that you don't have tox results yet. And so tox takes some time. And, over all my years of covering, death investigations, it's variable depending upon the tempo at which a particular office works at. I've seen tox results come back, say within 2 weeks, and I've seen them take up to 7 months before. And I don't want folks to think that I'm conflating the tox results, that is what's going on in their system relative to drugs that may have been on board. And I'm talking about therapeutic drugs, conflate that with the carbon monoxide finding, which they stated from autopsy was not present. Those are two separate things and two separate different types of testing. You can actually see carbon monoxide changes literally manifested physically before your eyes. There's certain things that we look for that they're actually quite striking when you're at an autopsy where somebody has been exposed to carbon monoxide. You take that and combine it with what the authorities had seen, where there was, they tested for leaks, both the fire department and the utilities people checked, and they didn't see any evidence of that.
It's interesting because you talk about the mummification part of it, and it's
Mhm.
really been reported that it was notable on her, and then for Gene Hackman, it wasn't, at least it hasn't been tied to him as much, that his body was
Yes.
decomposing, which you're the expert, I'm not, but 7 days, 9 days that after death, you would
Mhm.
assume that that decomposition would happen. So it is possible that she may have died first if the mummification is more clear on her than it would be on Gene Hackman.
Yeah, and I've put some thought into this, over these many days since this has happened.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we work in, or that we work with in medical legal death investigation, is to try to understand sequencing of events, whether it's one or two people or multitude of people. You try to understand sequencing and time. Time is, for us in our field, one of the biggest questions that police officers often have for us is how long. Okay, and it's a reasonable question. And many times, you're just going to have the evidence that's laid before you with the bodies. It's not like, where you're going to have a definitive time, but some of the things that you can look for are going to be these external changes with human remains. And I've thought about this, a variety of different scenarios, what could have happened. We do know that to a certain degree, Mr. Hackman was infirmed. I think he was still ambulatory. We have images of him, working or walking with a cane. He's kind of what's referred to as kyphotic, which means that he's bent over, kind of hunched over like this,
Mhm.
but he's still ambulatory. There have been some reports that he was participating in yoga and Pilates and these sorts of things. And I don't necessarily know how the authorities are going to validate that. But one of the themes that has run through that is that Ms. Arakawa was behind that, that she saw the value in that for Mr.
Yeah.
Hackman, to keep him limber, keep him moving. So if she is the caretaker and she had some kind of major medical event, we have these pills that are spilled about in the bathroom, the heater that's been knocked over. I still don't know, and I don't know that anyone knows what those meds were specific to her. Now, there were meds that were collected at the scene. Was she having some kind of event? Was it a cardiac event? Was it a cerebral event? And maybe she suddenly passed. Well, if she is his caretaker and he is dependent upon her, then that puts us into a different sphere at that point in time. Is he kind of wandering about the house, wondering, how does he solve this problem? What does he do? And over a period of time, he finally gives way and passes on. I found it quite fascinating the position of Mr. Hackman's body. He's in the mudroom. He has his sweatpants. He's fully clothed. He's got, I think, a long sleeve blue T-shirt, his cane, his slippers, and oh, by the way, he's got his sunglasses that are
Right,
lying
the
right
sunglasses.
right by his head. And I've talked to colleagues about this, and we were, kind of kicking this around and thinking, well, was he trying to get somewhere for help? Perhaps going, because with a mudroom, that's an exit point or an entry point for a home, generally on the backside. Was he trying to get out the door to go somewhere? I don't know. Was he oriented to time and space? Did he have anything going on that would have incapacitated his ability to communicate and those sorts of things? And there's still a lot of unknowns here, as well as should. I mean, we don't know everything about their lives, and I don't know that we ever will. But it seems as though that they had this in a very healthy way, a codependent relationship, with him being very dependent upon Betsy.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the medicine a bit because the sheriff would not go into details about
Hmm.
who the particular meds were prescribed to and what
Right.
the specific ones were on the counter. But we do know from a search warrant that there were three types of medication that were taken by deputies. One was a blood pressure, kind of calcium blocker medicine.
Yeah.
Another was a thyroid medication, and then some Tylenol.
Yeah.
Certainly, that paints a picture of some of the health issues in the house that happen with people as they get older. But I think about, as we try to think about what could happen, like if somebody was to overdose, is that
Mm.
possible with any of these medications?
Yeah, I suppose it is. Overdosing's generally possible with just about everything.
Right.
But depending upon what that med was, it was spread about. The one med that you mentioned, which is you had stated it's a blood pressure med.
And
It's
I'm
also
probably mispronouncing it, as I've said it on on YouTube multiple times. Dilatasum, I think it was something along those lines.
mhm,
It's like a
yes.
calcium blocker medication for blood pressure.
Yeah, for blood pressure, and here's the most important part, I think, for angina. So if you think about if you've ever been around anybody that takes nitroglycerin tablets, where it goes sublingual beneath the tongue, and they're having chest pains, um, it's not the same as nitro tablet, but it is used also in addition to blood pressure. Maintenance is also used for the purposes if you're experiencing angina or you have like chronic angina. So
And what is
that would
angina
indicate
for those
angina
who don't
is
know?
chest pain specifically. It's this
Okay.
kind of, and some people kind of have um, kind of a persistent angina, particularly if their blood pressure spikes and they have high blood pressure and it's not maintained, they'll always go around with, this kind of pain in their chest. And of course, when you're having, classic, what they refer to as a heart attack or an MI, it intensifies significantly. Sometimes people won't feel it at all, but obviously this is a diagnosis that's been made. They did collect, from my understanding, I don't have the warrant in front of me, but there was also a medical record program or something like
Yeah,
this
my quest.
that
Yeah,
yeah,
from like Quest
MyQuest that kind of
Diagnostics. Yeah.
yeah, and it kind of monitors what's going on. I think the key here, and if the police have ruled out, please keep in mind that in these kinds of cases, if the police have ruled out that this is something that is not sinister, it's not criminal, this investigation is going to migrate from them to the state ME. Okay. And the state ME and their investigators will have to get in contact with the attending physicians. Now, a real key here, I believe, is to find out when Ms. Arakawa and Mr. Hackman last had physician visits. Were they working on telemed, where they're just talking, over the computer to, some physician that's off somewhere, or were they actually going to a physician's office and being examined, where they're putting a blood pressure cuff on them and checking their blood sugar and all those other things that come along? I'd really be fascinated to know that. Uh, and there was kind of a little hint about this. I don't really know what to take away from this, but it has been stated, I believe, that as a result of COVID, Ms. Arakawa made the choice to isolate them. Now, I don't know if that isolation has continued. I don't necessarily think that it had, because Ms. Arakawa was involved. I think that she had opened a business with a friend in Santa Fe. Did they still get out and about the way they had in the past, or were they still just kind of at home? And if they're just at home, then did they have any kind of home health care that was coming by to check on them? You got to keep in mind, Gene Hackman's 95 years old.
Mhm.
He would need some type of care at some level. It's just, how extensive was that? And what were specifically, what were his diagnoses? Had he had any kind of heart problems in the past? Well, if you're talking about a pacemaker, yeah, there's a problem with the heart rhythm. Was he being treated for, um, as terrible as this is, dementia? And that would explain, this kind of lag in time. I
Yeah.
don't know if he was treated for it or not, but had that been going on? So these are people, and specifically Mr. Hackman, that would need to be seen by a physician, more frequently than not.
I think about the dog too, which is the kind
Yeah,
of this, it's like the third
yeah,
wheel to all of this is,
yeah,
if there was some event for him and a medical event for her, but then it's like this dog passes away. And we don't know
yeah.
how old the dog was. I've heard, and who hasn't heard theories over the last couple of days where if the dog was in a closet, maybe the dog didn't have access to food, and that could have been the cause of death. How long
Mhm.
typically does it take to do an autopsy on an animal?
Not long at all. Probably the same length, as as humans, and you would need somebody skilled in veterinary medicine, and they've got a great veterinary school there in New Mexico,
Mhm.
and they would do what's referred to on a dog as a necropsy, and these people are skilled at it. They can look for different things. I've heard the thing about the closet. I've also heard that this animal had been in a carrier.
Yeah, like a
And
kennel.
look,
Yeah.
man, yeah, and if he's locked up in there, and again, this is so horrible because I love dogs, I have to admit,
Yeah, sure.
and I know Mr. Hackman did too. Particularly, had an affinity for shepherds, and if that dog was in that kennel and the dog didn't have water, um, water is the key here. Within 2 to 3 days, that dog could pass on, and it would be quite a horrific death.
Yeah.
But again, you would have to establish that by doing an examination on the dog by a veterinarian that could give you an indication, because there's signs that you can see. For instance, I mentioned dehydration. There's things that you can actually look for. There are things that you can actually look for with dehydration that you can see grossly at autopsy or necropsy. When the animal's body is open, you can appreciate those sorts of things. And of course, there's testing, chemical testing that can be conducted on a blood draw as well. And I hope that they went to that length relative to this animal, because look, for every unanswered question, there will be more questions. It's best to go ahead, in my experience at least, to clear all these up when you have all of this stuff at your disposal from Jump Street.
And for you, just as we've followed this story, and it seems like it just has built up day by
Yeah.
day, where the news comes out, and Gene Hackman's one of the great
Mhm.
actors of all time, and
Oh yeah.
and then there's the phrase, they say no signs of foul play, but then the question becomes like, well, then what is it? And that just seems to
Yeah.
be a question that's been getting bigger. How uncommon is this type of situation? Like for you in all your years, how often have you seen something like this where at this point it just doesn't seem like we have answers?
It's not uncommon, and again, this comes back to not just the exam that the pathologist did the other day, but everything that is still, kind of hanging out there relative to histological testing, the tissue that I'd mentioned, or not testing, but examination once those slides are fixed, and also the toxicology. The toxicology will go to the state lab, and one of the I think that one of the things that people lose sight of is that, yes, Mr. Hackman is an international superstar. And as far as I'm concerned, next to Robert Duvall, my two favorite actors, by the way, I'm heartbroken
Mm,
over this.
yeah.
Um, but they're citizens. And there is a whole line of people that have been autopsied, and their blood work and their urine and everything else that we get at autopsy has gone as well. So unless there is some person that steps up and says, we're going to move this to the front of the line, we'll have to wait until those samples are tested. And there's nothing underhanded or sinister about it. It's just that it's the nature of government and the way government works when you're talking about testing samples. It's been well documented over the years that crime labs are really backed up, and they're backed up in many cases because of a lot of DUI blood draws that supersedes many things. And even in my experience, DUI blood draws will literally trump homicide cases because there's
Hmm.
so many of them, and so it really gets clogged up. And I'm saying all of this just so that people kind of understand why it takes so long. And you want them to be thorough. They're going to run. We have what's referred to as a standard panel, which are major drugs of abuse. That's done for everybody. And then you look for therapeutic drugs that are prescribed, by the physician. Okay. So in addition to that, we have these other drugs that were mentioned in this legal document, and we have this open vial of medication that's spread on the counter. So all of that those drugs will be specifically tested for, so that you can get levels. And when it comes to medication, you literally have what are referred to as therapeutic levels and you have toxic levels. And that applies to just about any kind of drug that's out there, even aspirin or acetaminophen, or whatever it is that you want to talk about. They all have therapeutic levels and they have toxic levels, and so you have to examine that in that context. And then on top of it, you have this issue of these bodies have been down for a while, and so that can, to a certain degree, it can create a problem. It's not going to be anything that they can't overcome, but it further exacerbates the situation.
Yeah, it's fascinating to talk about. Obviously, the loss of life and is sad, and you think of their families, and so many people just are interested to hear how this happened and to see this story play out. Joseph Scott Morgan, it's always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thank you for your perspective. We appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you, guys.
The sheriff says it could take weeks, if not longer, for the final autopsy and toxicology test results to come back, but we'll continue to follow this story as those questions continue to be asked. For On the Case, presented by Law and Crime, I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.